Hello, my name is Chris Lawton and I'm Director of Knowledge Exchange here at Farm Credit East. If I could have the next slide, please, Kyle. So, of course, the mandatory disclaimer that the information here is presented in good faith and believed to be accurate at the time. However, we specifically disclaim any warranty for any information contained in this webinar. If I could have the next slide, please. So today we're going to have some introductions, as I'm doing right now. Then we're going to have Eric Snodgrass, Principal Atmospheric Scientist at Nutrient Ag Solutions, give a presentation, followed by Rich Morrison, Vice President of Farm Services, NAU Country Crop Insurance. And then we'll have some closing remarks and wrap up. We will have time for questions following each presenter's presentation. So first, I'll begin by introducing Eric Snodgrass. Mr. Snodgrass is the Principal Atmospheric Scientist for Nutrient Ag Solutions, where he develops predictive analytical software solutions to manage weather risk for global production agriculture. He provides frequent weather updates that focus on how high impact weather events influence global agriculture productivity. He is an excellent presenter. We're lucky to have him, and I will turn it over to Eric to begin his presentation and share his screen.
All right, I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak today, and I've got a lot I'd like to share with you all, so I'm not going to spend much time just chit-chatting here. I'm going to get right on into this. So let's give me just a second here to start sharing my screen. And it looks like there, I think you can see it. I have a quick question for you all, and that is, if I start drawing on this screen, can you see my drawings? Looks like you can see them. Is that right? Can someone give me a verbal yes, you can see it?
Yes, we can see it. There is a slight delay, but I think that's just because of the nature of using a internet browser. So
yeah, no problem there. Well, I'm going to go straight on into my my main slide here. So just something I want to make sure that I can put in the hands of all of you right away. On my main slide here, you see there's a URL at the bottom. I'll make sure to copy this into the chat so everyone has it. But you know, when it comes to discussing weather and its impacts on everything we do, just we all understand that it's going to change, and it's going to change quickly. And to stay ahead of those changes and to understand how weather is going to influence a bigger picture, I do produce a morning report, and it's free. It's completely free. If you go to the URL down here at the bottom and just put your email address in, all that happens is your email goes onto my distribution list, and you'll start getting a morning email from me. It's in the form of a report. It's got a lot of great maps and insight just about what weather's doing to impact production ag, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And again, it's designed to be deleted. So if you don't care today, just delete it, and you can get a new one tomorrow. But it's a resource that Nutrient provides completely free and no obligation. You can unsubscribe at any time. It won't hurt my feelings, but just want to give you that stuff there to take advantage of. So we're going into a pretty hectic week here, and what's happening right now is I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and the temperatures outside are about to hit 70 Fahrenheit. We've opened up the Gulf of Mexico in a big way, and it's going to be spreading quite a bit of moisture through the midsection of the United States. We're looking at some very, very heavy rainfalls. Just before this call, I did a radio interview out of Springfield, Illinois. We're talking about 2 to 3 inches of rain and then 5 to 8 inches of snow on top of all of that. So it's going to be quite a mess right in this part of the Corn Belt. And we do have flood watches out for big parts of New England. I'll show you those in just a few moments. But you know, I'm thinking about all of this. It's kind of funny when we teach new students about atmospheric sciences, one of the first things we teach them about are the layers of the atmosphere. And the lowest of all of those layers is called the troposphere. And tropos in Greek means overturning. It's the layer of the atmosphere that has a lot of just vertical motion. And if, you know, you distill everything down, what I do on a day-to-day basis, I'm trying to look for where the atmosphere is going to overturn, where it's going to change. And to do that, I ultimately have to understand some pretty important things about the atmosphere. So this is kind of fun. Back in December, I was leaving to give a talk, and my son, who's 9 years old, you know, asked me, it's like, Dad, where are you going? I said, I told him, and he goes, what are you going to talk about? And I said, the weather. And he asked me, he goes, well, why do we have weather? And I think what he was really asking is, why do you have to go tell people about it? but I answered his actual question. And I said, well, Graham, let me show you something here. I said, when you look at Earth, you know where the equator is, right, bud? And he said, yeah. I said, well, the equator is the part of our planet that receives the most direct sunlight. I said, the polar regions receive the least direct, and the atmosphere can't stand it. all that heat that's built up over the equator has to get exhausted, either north or south, because the atmosphere is constantly striving for some level of equilibrium. And I said, don't forget, the whole thing is spinning. And as it spins, we see that it orbits around the sun with a little bit of a tilt on its axis. And I said, and that means that sometimes of the year, the sun's rays are more direct in the northern hemisphere. We call that summer here. I said, and the other time here, it's more direct in the southern hemisphere. They call that winter here. And I said, and basically what happens is the atmosphere is in this constant mode of heaving itself into a more comfortable position. And I said, Graham, it behaves in a nonlinear and chaotic way. Now, to a 9-year-old, nonlinear and chaotic behavior of a fluid system doesn't make a lick of sense. But he is into dinosaurs. And so I decided to talk to him about it by referencing a great movie. This, of course, is the scene from the Jurassic Park, 1993. You got the old Ford Explorers out there and the big T-Rex that breaks through the high tension, power lines keeping them in, and the movie is reaching, its apex here. Now, if you remember this movie, just before this scene, when they're driving along in these Ford Explorers here, there's a scene where Jeff Goldblum's character is in the Ford Explorer with Laura Dern's character. Now, Jeff Goldblum is supposed to represent the scientist, and it's a terrible representation of what we're actually like, but whatever. And in this scene, he takes a little drip of water from a cup and drips it on her hand, and he does it twice. And one time the water rolls one direction, and the second time it goes another way. And what he says, he goes, look, that's how chaotic systems work. Slight variations in your skin and the hair and all, blah, blah, blah. And he's basically trying to hit on her, and it's really unsuccessful. But the reality of it is that this little demonstration of chaos theory was actually stolen. This pickup line here was stolen by from this guy. And this is kind of a fun bit of what I want to share with you today. This is Edward Lorenz. He is the father of modern chaos theory. This is the guy that figured it out, and he figured it out a long time ago. 1948, he wrote a paper where he was asked to tell people what the limits of prediction are with respect to weather. So I always get asked, how far out can you see? How far out can you predict the weather with any sort of accuracy? Well, that question was answered 70 years ago by this guy right here. And this is what he said. 1948, he said, even with perfect technology, and I mean, we're nowhere close to perfect technology now, but he said, even with perfect technology, the farthest you'll ever be able to predict the weather accurately into the future is 21 days. That means if I want to pinpoint the forecast on your field, how far out can I do it? 21 days. You want to know where we currently stand? This is where we currently stand. Our 3-day forecasts went from the 80s being 80% accurate to now in the 2020s at being 98% accurate. So we're there at 3 days out. Our 5-day forecast from the 80s was down here around 60% accurate. It is currently at about 92%. Our 7-day forecast is up to about 80% accurate. And look at this. The 10-day forecast currently is a 50-50. So that's the reality of it. I'm thinking about what's going to be happening here in the next couple of weeks. We're going to be seeing a major shift toward the end of this month towards some really cold air. I'll show it to you in a few minutes. A week and a half ago, it was forecast that the end of the month of February is going to be warm. So it shows you how much this fluctuates around. Now, to prove to you that this guy knew what he was talking about in 1948, I want to show you something. Back in October of last year, a monster winter storm blew up right here in parts of Colorado and Wyoming. It was big. It produced a bunch of snow on the backside. This was in Bozeman, Montana, just blanketed it with snow. In fact, the snow got all the way back to Idaho. When it was all said and done, this whole area in the year picked up between 6 and 18 inches of snow on October 13th. Now, from there to the south, there was a severe weather outbreak, including 15 tornado reports. We had a squall line that ripped right over the top of the winter wheat belt. You can see it here in this radar animation. And this was one of the pictures of one of those tornadoes in Sharon Springs, Kansas. Now, why am I talking about it? Well, take a look at this. That system started here, okay, and went all the way across the United States, exiting through Maine. And everything you're looking at on this map shows you the rain or the total precipitation from that one event. Now, why I remember it is because this went right over the top of my house in mid-October. I live right over here in East Central Illinois, and that chased us out of the fields for about 10 days. We couldn't harvest. Beans were lodged. Everything was soaking wet. We had 2.5 inches of rain in October. Now, the application is, when did we know this was going to happen? Are you ready for this? Well, this is how we trace weather systems and figure out where they are and where they came from. We look at the upper levels for what we call troughs and ridges. Troughs in blue, when it gets cold, inclement weather, these are the types of systems that deliver all of our, the crazy weather we get. What are the ridges? They're in red. That's when it's hot and dry. So that arrow is pointing to the trough that produced that blizzard. Now I'm going to trace it back one day at a time. We're going to go back 13 days to see where that little feature was, because it was over Alaska about a week before. And before that, it was sitting somewhere here in the North Pacific, and go back about 10, maybe 11 or 12 days. And it was this little tiny wiggle in the flow of the atmosphere north of Japan. Now, where was it before that? It was here, a typhoon just west of Japan. 2 days before that, on September 28th, it was north and east of the Philippines. 2 days before that, on the 26th, it was right here. On the 24th, there. And on September 22nd, 21 days before this was a high plains blizzard, it was this little itty tiny break in the wind right there. Now I'm going to tell you something. There was not a soul on the face of the earth that saw that little itty bitty wiggle in the flow of the atmosphere and said, oh, we better look out. This is going to be a high plains blizzard that's going to stop harvest in Midwest and soak parts of the Northeast in about 21 to 25 days. You see, that's what a nonlinear chaotic system does. It can take small little changes in the flow, like you see right here, and turn them into huge, potentially huge weather systems. So I show you this to make a point here. I never, ever feel like this when forecasting the weather. You got this kid here who dad pitches in the wiffle ball. He hits it out of the park, shoots it on its way out, epic bat flip. Mom waddles over and she's like, oh, that's my boy. He's going to be in the MLB someday. My mom says, why'd you screw up the forecast for Labor Day this past weekend? We asked you about it a month early and you said, I'm like, Mom, we can't forecast the weather out that far. There's no point in even trying to do it. I'm also tell you this, there's no secret sauce with all of this. There's nobody out there that's got, some claim that they've figured out something that allows them to predict the weather more accurately than anybody else. Because if that were really true, they would never tell you about it, right? So make sure that when you are hearing about some things where people talk about, all these crazy things like the planets lining up and all these weird stuff that they use to forecast the weather, that all of that's snake oil. Somebody told this little boy watching here that he was reading and he's bought into it. Don't buy into the snake oil. Prediction is hard. I've showed you the limit of it, and I'll explain to you where we currently stand. We're going to do 3 things in the last half hour that I got with you today. I want to talk about Brazil. I want to talk about the central United States and why that's critical for the Northeast. And then I'm going to finish up talking about ocean temperatures. You get those 3 things out of me in the next 30 minutes, we did well. So when it comes to the Earth not liking the fact that it's a nonlinear chaotic system that's unevenly heated, the way that it vents all of that is by producing the jet stream. And that's the jet stream today. Now I focused over here in the Pacific because I want to talk about the Pacific, specifically the war that we waged there back in the 1940s. In retaliation to the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the fact that the Japanese had entered the war, we went right in after them, and we had to try to fight the Japanese, which was difficult because of the expanse of the Pacific Ocean. We had a bomber, it's called the B-17, the Fortress. It was a workhorse. It was what delivered the bombs over in Europe. But there was a problem. It was too small, too slow, and couldn't fly far enough. The U.S. invested several $1 billion to make the one you see down here called the Super Fortress, the B-29. And the B-29 offered several advantages, but the biggest of which was that it could fly 5,500 miles on a single tank of fuel. Now, why am I telling you about this? Take a look at this graphic here. That is the position of the jet stream today. Now, rewind the clock back into the 1940s, and the jet stream still looked like this, but we had no idea it existed. You see, what happened was we overtook a bunch of islands right inside that circle, one of which is Guam, put a bunch of military installations, put down long enough runways that we could put the B-29 there. And then, to retaliate against Japan, we decided to run this flight plan to bomb Japan. You fly in low. Why do you fly in low? Because the planes were not pressurized, nor did they have heaters. Once we got on the northern side of Japan, climbed to 30,000 feet, make the turnaround, come back over the top at 30,000 feet, which was out of the range of the Japanese guns, drop the bombs, which are mostly made of napalm and other incendiary bombs, get back home fast. In other words, go in low, climb up high, drop the bombs, and get back. We missed our targets almost every day for a year. And the newly formed Air Force was seen as a major flop, and they fired the main general in charge of the Air Force. And who they brought in to replace him was this guy, General Curtis LeMay. So this newly formed Air Force now had its second general, and this guy says, "Why are you missing all your targets?" And the pilots reported back that sometimes it seemed as though the winds were really fighting against the aircraft, and sometimes they seemed to push the bombs around quite a bit. So this guy goes, "All right, get a bunch of these guys in here, we'll figure this out." So they brought in a bunch of meteorologists. These are my people right here. And we launched weather balloons. And the weather balloons, as they carried up into the depths of the troposphere, remember us talking about that? Well, we found out that the winds up there were sometimes 200 to 250 miles an hour. So these guys come back to General Curtis LeMay and said, "Listen, don't fight the jet stream. Fly low, fly at night, and bomb." Now that was unheard of to the pilots in World War II, because the reason why they fly high was to avoid getting shot down. And flying at night required radar systems. But they built all of that, changed the strategy, flew at night, and we never missed again. You had to get out of the jet stream, because that jet stream can sometimes be so strong that the plane's forward speed was actually going backwards. Now, the Japanese knew about the jet stream. Did you know that they actually put their own incendiary bombs on big tethers connected to huge balloons, put them up in the jet stream, and had them go over to North America? It was a terribly unsuccessful campaign to bomb us. We found remnants of these bombs all over the place, but didn't find anything where they really exploded. A couple of them came back to Japan and blew up right there. So they abandoned this technique. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, ultimately, it boils down to understanding how the wind systems on Earth are going to interact. And what I want to teach you today is how the trade winds, which blow from east to west, ultimately drive the entire system. They govern how the westerlies flow, and the westerlies ultimately tell us how the atmosphere is going to behave. And to understand that, we're going to start in South America, where trade winds are strongest. This is what the monsoonal circulation looks like in South America. The winds come here off the tropics, they make the turn around Bolivia, and deliver along their way a whole bunch of rain. We know that Brazil can produce a lot of grain on that rain. And if you've never seen the data, I'll show you what the soybean numbers look like first. Their yield curve since 1977 matches what we have in the United States, but their production is exponentially increasing. And that's because every year they add about 3.5% of their total land area to new production. And if you're unaware of how much land area that is, I can show you by comparing it to the United States. Their increase every year of around 4 million hectares of land is like adding the total production of Kansas into production with soybeans every year. So we got questions to ask here in the middle part of my talk. Do we expect this production to continue to stay increasing with time? We got to know that, because this will drive some of the big grain markets around the world, what the production out of South America looks like. Now, if you're unaware of how big of a growing area we have in Brazil, I could fit 9 Indianas and 1 Tennessee inside of their biggest producing state, which is called Mato Grosso. This is where they grow the cotton, the corn, and the soy. That's the big area right in through there. And that particular area has a very important seasonality to its precipitation, where it's driven by the monsoon, where the flow comes around, just like those black arrows show. Down south to Argentina, they're governed by frontal boundaries, just like we are here in North America. But I want to talk to you about northern Brazil for a moment, because what I'm about to share with you is going to be critical to the success of future crops in Brazil. You see, Brazil has a very distinct dry season. It's their winter, our summer. And what happens is every September, they wait for 2 things to happen. One is the date that the government sets up that allows them to plant. That's September the 15th. Two, they got to wait on the monsoon to start. Once the monsoon starts, it begins to rain. They can plant as fast as they possibly can to get the crop going. They got to do that because they want to harvest it by January into February. They want to do that so they can plant what they call their safrinha crop, which is the second or smaller crop. 75% of their total corn production actually happens after the beans. And every year it's a race for when the monsoon starts and when the monsoon stops. Now, we've been studying this monsoon for a long time, and I want to share with you some important research. What we've learned is that the dry season, which again goes from May to September, that dry season is expanding in length. And I'll just point out some research that's over here on the right. October is the critical month to getting the rain to return so that they can have a successful start to the growing season. And what we've measured since 1980, look at it right here, there's been a systematic decrease overall in total precipitation in October. And what that means is they're getting about 2 inches less rainfall. 2020 was the driest October in a long time. 2021 was also dry, but not nearly as dry. And we look at these two things and say, wow, they were both pretty dry. Why this year have they planted so quickly? Because the planting progress from a year ago versus this year, two entirely different situations. 2020 slowest in decades, 2021 fastest in the last 5 years. How did they do it? Because it was dry in October. They did it on a forecast. You see, our forecast models were predicting that once November got here, the rains were going to come in big time. So they took a gamble and planted into dry conditions, banking on the forecast models being right on when the rain was going to arrive. And the forecast models absolutely nailed it. On the left was the forecast, on the right is the verification. And while northern Brazil went into a great growing season, southern Brazil, 40% of the total production was stuffed away into drought. Now, the way by which we have to monitor weather in Brazil is a little more difficult than what we do here in the United States. We have to rely a lot on satellite imagery to assess what's going on. And those satellites give us some brilliant animations and images. This is the last week's worth of rain around the globe from these satellite observations. And what I can do with these is I can use them to assess how wet or dry things are in South America. Now, in North America, I don't. I use our radar network. But in South America, I rely on the satellites. One of NASA's satellites called GRACE measured this for us, which is showing you here root zone soil moisture. The drought extended from southern Brazil into Paraguay, Uruguay, and northern Argentina. It's one of the driest starts to a growing season on record. Now, this goes up to January 17th. After mid-January, it did rain. But the latest update from GRACE, which came out on Valentine's Day, still shows big parts of southern Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and northern Argentina very dry. Now, Mato Grosso, they've had nearly perfect growing season. But south of there into Paraná, in fact, you can fit 2 Illinois inside of one Paraná, that state. They've been extremely dry. And the deficits there are over 50% on their rainfall. You go south of there down in Argentina, I just want to make a point here. The peak of the dry part back in December and January, they were averaging daytime high temperatures of 103 to 108 degrees Fahrenheit and overnight lows in the 80s. Now, it rained really heavily after, January 23rd. They got 7 inches of rain in some places on January 23rd. But that, you know how that is. You're in drought, and then all of a sudden heavy rain comes in and it goes back over dry. We're talking problems continue to show up here. So we did notice that after those rains came through, the NDVI imagery brightened up. See how much more bright it got here in Argentina? But before that, watch this go back over. We were looking at a crop that was the least healthy we'd seen from space going back over 20 years. So what's gone on since then? Well, the projection of 145 million metric ton of soybeans has now been dropped to about 125. That's a 20 million metric ton reduction. That'll make this probably the 4th largest crop on record, but it was posed to be the largest by a long shot. And it's impacting how quickly they're harvesting it. Because in the north, the crop is coming out very quickly, but in the south, it's taking a long time to get it. But the harvest pace right now is well above the 5-year average when we look at the whole of Mato Grosso. The forecast going forward will be bringing in some drier conditions to the north. And I'm going to make this into one solid point here in just a few moments. You see, as we progress forward throughout the rest of South America's growing season, Most economists, most meteorologists are neutral to lower when it comes to thinking about what we'll be getting out of the safrinha crop, which is going in relatively quickly. Just to make you aware of how big the safrinha crop is, since 1990, they've added 60,000 square miles into production. That's like adding the entire state of Georgia as one massive cornfield that's grown after the soybeans. Impressive to say the least. The crop's gone in pretty quickly. Last year we were at 20.9% planted. They're currently almost at 60% planted. But there's concerns going forward, and I just want to finish up with South America right here. So that crop, as it's going in, may face problems with drought later on in March, April, and May. Nearly every long-range weather forecast model puts over 80% of South America's growing area into drought risk as we finish the second crop. So the thing about this is, if you want to think about how South American weather could impact commodity prices, if commodities are going to trade weather right now, what I just gave you is very, very bullish news coming out of South America. So we'll have to watch how that changes going into North American spring. So let's talk about that. Okay, what are my last two bullet points? The first one is going to show up with understanding the way the atmosphere behaves, again, with that jet stream. You see, there are several different types of blocking patterns that the jet stream can get set up in. And what's a block? It's where high pressure sits over your area and just blocks all of the rain and keeps it away from you. Last summer, we had a big Rex block, which was over the West Coast. It was sat right there. Look at that, a huge ridge in the flow of the atmosphere. What that Rex block did was smoked out the Northwest, ruined the crops across Canada, which had their driest summer since 1979, and also lit the West on fire. You can see here the wildfire smoke that we saw across the West last summer. We monitor that smoke, and throughout New England, we have smoke from those fires that covered the New England states. In fact, we measured up to a 15% reduction in sunlight in July just from the smoke from these Western wildfires. But across the West, that's where the heat was. The summer across New England, in fact, most of the rest of the country was mild at best, whereas records were falling across the West for heat. That's where the ridge was last year. And every year, my job is to figure out where it's going to go. Because the ridge was over the West, you had to go west of the Mississippi River to see the drought areas. We saw across New York, Pennsylvania, we had several regions up through here that had a very, very wet summer. About the only places that were dry in the east were right down here along the Appalachian Mountains between Virginia and West Virginia. Nearly every other location was quite wet. We had an active hurricane season because of that. We had several systems that rolled through New England, but many of them came right down here into this Gulf Coast, the worst of which was Hurricane Ida. It was a Cat 4 hurricane in the animation that you're watching here. And as Ida slammed into Louisiana, it caused some major problems with our supply chain. One, it hit one of the busiest ports in North America. That would be the Mississippi River. When it came through, it pushed about 10 feet of water into southern Louisiana. That's called storm surge, of course. And downtown New Orleans looked like this for about 6 straight hours. But that powerful hurricane, look at this graphic, stopped the Mississippi. Normally, the Mississippi River will discharge at a rate of around 350,000 cubic feet per second. But when Ida came in, Ida's winds pushed against the river and for a few hours forced the river to go backwards. The level in the water rose up about 12 feet and then the hurricane moved on and all that water came out. Now, why we're talking about it is because Hurricane Ida also took offline a lot of our natural gas and oil refinement, which hit nitrogen in a huge way. That's where we get most of it. So this was a very disruptive system. But as we went through fall and got into winter, December and January couldn't have been but polar opposites of what they were in terms of weather. December smashing records as one of the warmest on record, beating records that go back to the 1930s. And as we progress forward, we saw, because of that pattern, a whole lot of severe weather. Take a look at this. On December the 10th, because of the jet stream set up to where we just kept opening the Gulf of Mexico, we had one event that hit parts of the Midwest and Mid-South, producing 750,000 lightning strikes in one evening. My favorite website for this, by the way, is called blitzertongue.org. We also saw, based on our radar data, how big this system was as it plowed through the midsection of the country. And that squall line that you see right there produced over 400 reports of severe weather on December the 10th. And it produced this massive tornado, which you're seeing here, lit up by lightning. You'll see it again in a few seconds. There it is. That was the Mayfield, Kentucky tornado. Our radar network was able to keep a warning time ahead of this between 30 and 90 minutes as it tracked across 4 states, producing speeds that were over 190 miles an hour. It threw debris into the upper levels of the atmosphere up to 30,000 feet, which was then found over 200 miles away from this tornado. Why am I talking about it? I'm talking about it for this particular reason. You know, you think about Tornado Alley and you immediately think about the Midwest or the plains, right? Well, over the last 42 years, Tornado Alley is shifting. And wherever you see these shades of colors, which includes New England, we've measured an increase in severe weather events, specifically tornadic thunderstorms. So when you think every year about protecting yourself from severe weather, what I want you to know is over the last 42 years, we've observed an increase in the frequency of high impact summer thunderstorms. It's greatest over the Mid-South, but it extends into New England. Keep that in mind. We saw another big wind event that happened right here just 5 days later. And that particular wind event raced across the country at speeds up to 90 miles an hour. Now, why am I talking about the Midwest so much? It's because I want you to remember something very specific. And this is my second bullet point here as I pull in the last about 12 or 13 minutes. My second bullet point for everybody listening right now is shown right here, not this radar animation, but in this satellite animation. Oops, here it is. Because as that storm system rolled through, do you see all of this on the backside of that low? Look at it again, it'll keep playing for you. Before the sun sets, the visible satellite image picked up on a bunch of dust. See it right there? 5 separate times the Southern Plains endured dust storms this fall and winter. And why this is so important is those dust storms are indicative of how dry things are right now in the Southern Plains. Now, why should you care about it? The current drought monitor doesn't show much drought in New England. Got a couple of places where it's abnormally dry, but overall, we still have 72% of the country in some stage of drought, and most of it's focused in the West. Why do we care about this? This is why. Over the last 3 months, we have seen at times drought expand in the plains. It's down here. And I want to tell you something, listen carefully. If this drought area expands into South Dakota, into Iowa, into Missouri or Arkansas, that is going to be mission critical to the upcoming forecast for New England. You're kind of saying, well, why would that be the case? Well, my last 2 bullet points today are going to make that case. In the event of this region developing drought in summer, we tend to develop high pressure over the top of it. And the jet stream goes right around it. If it goes around it, we tend to be very stormy in New England. A lot of storms, severe storms as well. So right now, what should you be watching? You need to watch, well, let me rephrase that. I need to watch, and I'll tell you about it. We need to watch the drought area in the southern plains of the United States to see if it expands. Because if it expands, it will really impact the weather across New England going forward. That's bullet point number 2. Number 1, South America. Number 2, watch expanding drought in the southern plains of the United States. It's the greatest extent of drought we've observed in the United States since August 2012. So far this year, we've been dry in pockets in New England. It's been much wetter right down here from Pennsylvania getting back over toward Kentucky, West Virginia. But this is a region that's missed out on a lot of snow. In fact, you want to see the snow? This is through yesterday morning where we have snow compared to average. So yeah, we've not seen some of the big snowstorms we'd like to see in New England. Neither in the Midwest. Major deficits of snowfall in through here. We currently have snow on the ground as shown to you right here in this image, which means if we're going to continue to work on this drought situation, we need to see some big systems roll through the country delivering the snow. And I've got a couple dialed for you. So let's talk about them. I'm going to skip this and get right to here. You want to see good moisture return from everywhere east of the Rocky Mountains? You got to get the jet stream to come out of the southwest. That's it. Southwest flow in the jet stream delivers the moisture. So today, the temperatures are cranking. You know how this works. It's February, and you bring up the temperatures like this in February, you are going to bring with it a bunch of moisture. And right now, we've got flood watches that extend from Missouri all the way through Vermont. This whole area is about to get quite a bit of precipitation, not just out of the first storm system, but the one that follows it. We've got red flag warnings in Texas. That's for fire. Told you it's dry here. Winter storm watches and warnings go right through my backyard here. This system's going to be very, very windy. Just through the next 2.5 days, we will see wind gusts stretching from the eastern Corn Belt through New England. They're going to be approaching 30 to 50 miles an hour. So get ready for some windy conditions. And this is where it all comes from. Ready? We play this forward tonight into tomorrow. The front sets up and starts to deliver rain. The rains are in green. The pinks represent ice and the blues are snow. So starting tomorrow through Thursday afternoon and evening, getting into Friday, this is a multi-day event where we get snow on the back side of it here from this particular system. That's just round number one. That one's out of here by 6 p.m. on Friday. Another little clipper rolls through on Saturday, delivering some light snow there on Saturday. And then the next big show showed up right here on Tuesday. See it taking shape there on Tuesday? That one then goes over the top of us as well. So I'm not worried about drought in New England. I'm worried about the fact that each one of these systems keeps missing this area. This is the next 10 days precipitation compared to average. And you see there's a big area on the backside where it has been dry, that is going to continue to be dry. California had its driest January on record in the Central Valley, and we're expecting it to do a repeat of that in the month of February. Meanwhile, from the Mid-South all the way to Maine, getting into southern Quebec and Ontario, we're looking at a surplus of 2.5 to 3 inches of rainfall just in the next 10 days. We're going to avoid some of the ice from the first system, but this is what we're looking at in terms of snow. Where there is snow, it will be deep into the interior. Best chance of getting more than 3 inches is pretty far into the interior. What's happening after that? It's going to get cold. You see, a lot of cold air stored up in the Canadian prairie that's going to replace this once the next system rolls through. So this is the way that the end of February looks on our temperature patterns. Highly volatile temperature pattern moving forward. All right, I've got just a few more minutes to give you my final bullet point. Let's talk about it. When we stretch this out and look longer term, there's a couple things I want you to know. One, polar vortex, not split, not messed up. This is not a year of the polar vortex. That was last year. What are we looking at going forward? Well, throughout the month of March, we expect it to stay unsettled from the Mid-South all the way into New England. Where do we see drought expanding? Right where we've been most concerned about it, in the plains. To get to my final bullet point, which today is talking about ocean temperatures, I want to show you the typical jet stream pattern when you have a La Nina, which we have now, versus an El Nino. We've had a very typical La Nina winter, and the question is, where's that La Nina going? Because this La Nina right now is still pretty strong, staying back over to the east, but it's fading in the Central Pacific. And while that's going on, we got quite a bit of cold water that's here in the North Pacific. Now you're saying, well, what about the warm water over here? Well, turns out what's much more important is what's happening in the Pacific Ocean setting up that jet stream pattern. That's why I'm talking about the Pacific. This is more of a bigger factor next summer when we get into hurricane season. So La Nina is fading. It peaked in December. It is now warming with time, and we expect to be INSO neutral by spring, and up to 25% of the forecast members of this model, this European model, are projecting that we'll have El Nino by midsummer. La Nina is fading. We know a thing or two about it, and I'm going to skip this slide if you don't mind, just in the interest of time, and show you what we're most concerned about. You see, going through the remainder of winter, March and April, I buy in, and of course, to the forecast here by the National Weather Service. They've got you with better chances of above average precipitation. They've got drier weather in the plains. See it right there? Warmth, well, it'll be highly volatile, but we may favor more warm days than cold days in New England. What about the drought outlook? Remember what I said we need to look out for? The National Weather Service is worried that the drought in the plains expands into this area, and that's where you see drought development likely. Keep an eye on that, because that could give you those ridge runners bringing the storms for this upcoming spring and summer. Let's take a look at what the world's best model is, and this is where I'm going to stop today, okay? You ever watch kids play pin the tail on the donkey? What do? We blindfold them, give them something sharp and push them off in a certain direction. What happens when you give them that little push when they're blindfolded? Don't they always walk in the direction that they're pushed? The atmosphere, when it comes to being modeled by the world's best weather forecast models, has the same problem. It is a bit blindfolded, which means it moves the direction we push it. And what I'm showing you here is that the 3-month sliding window through spring and into summer, you see what I see, right? It wants to expand the drought here and bring in, look at this, see this ring of wetter weather surrounding it? That's exactly what the models are doing. And I'm here to tell you something important. This is entirely based upon the fact that the models were pushed in a direction where there was already drought here, and the cold water in the Gulf of Alaska suggests that that drought should expand. So I'll tell you what I just told a group today that are coming out of Illinois, Iowa, much of the Midwest. Any given year in the Midwest, doesn't matter what winter did, but starting in spring, the risk year on year for drought is 30%. This year it's 38%. And right now, every long range model, we got it all in our US models, wants to keep the corn belt, eastern corn belt, through New England wet in spring and summer. They want to keep the central plains hot and dry. If the markets are going to move on a story, this is the story that the weathermen are telling them right now, that all the models want to keep where it's dry, dry. And I think that's going to be the case until we see something different. The reality of it is all of these models are garbage. They do their best possible case at trying to forecast. But what I tell you at the beginning, what would Edward Lorenz say about me showing you a 7-month forecast, which is what you're looking at here for precipitation? He'd say, Eric, we can't even pin down the next 21 days. We can look at the odds of being wetter or drier, warmer or colder, but all of this is speculative. And I want to be very clear about that. I have got on my watch here 11:43 local time, which means I've left just a couple of moments for some questions. But I had a lot I wanted to share with you today. So I'm going to stop there. If the questions have come in, please fire them my way. But if you don't have time now, just go right back to the beginning. You can get signed up for that report, and that gives you access to my email, or you can get my email here to ask me questions. But did it come in that I can answer the next minute or two?
Wow, Eric, that was a lot of information. A little overwhelming, actually. Presented, pretty quickly, but good stuff. We don't have any questions that have come in from the audience at the moment.
Sure.
Do you have any last thoughts about like things that I guess producers in the Northeast should have their eyes open for going, as we kind of wrap up winter and think about spring?
Yeah, what the big idea here that we have is that there are no indications of drought development through spring or early summer. No indications. The thing that I'm most concerned about is that this is going to be a year in the Northeast where we're going to have increased risk of severe storms. Not the case last year, it is the case this year. The other thing I'd tell you is if you think about the market behavior, if it's running on weather, it's worried about worse conditions in Brazil than have been reported. That's why we started with that. And the second thing is it's going to be focused on the concern of risk of the primary corn and soybean belt and throughout the central plains. I think all of that is going to weigh heavily on the minds of farmers and also in terms of market behavior. And it was a lot of information in 45 minutes. Do you realize how I just gave you a graduate level class on how all this stuff works? And that's okay, because the beauty of it is that we take it in now, but I provide daily content that makes it more digestible right here at this site, and that's free. I'm not pitching product, that's free. You can get access to it. So that's what I wanted to present to you. All right.
Yeah, thanks for that resource. So another question is, it seems, I guess, to a layperson that we're getting about the same level of precipitation that we've historically received in the Northeast, but it seems to be coming more intermittently, like we're getting more severe, heavy rainstorms and severe weather events and high rainfall events, and then more periods of dryness in between. So we get the same moisture over the season, but it seems to be, I mean, is there anything to that, do you think? Or is that just random?
No, that's not random. I'm trying to bring up a website right now, but maybe it's my slow hotel internet that's not letting it happen. The Northeast actually increased slightly in total precipitation for your growing season. If I remember correctly, you're up about 3 inches on total since 1970. But you have almost quadrupled the frequency of heavy rainfall events defined as 2 inches of rainfall or more in a 24-hour time period. So you're getting more rain, but you're getting it in huge helpings rather than in smaller amounts. Maybe I can show this real quick. Tell me where you're located right now.
I'm in Connecticut, personally.
Where in Connecticut? Give me a town.
Oh, Enfield. You want a zip code or?
No, well, how do you spell? Is that spelled with an I or an E?
Enfield.
Okay. Enfield, Connecticut. Why didn't that show up? Enfield. There's a lot of Enfields. Enfield?
Yep, there you go.
That's not showing up for me in my list. I most certainly monitor the weather there. Well, what I was going to do is bring up this particular tool. I don't know. I do know that I have Providence in here. Well, that's
Sure.
that's Rhode Island. I'm so sorry. Give me another Connecticut town real quick. I'm sorry.
Hartford.
There you go, Hartford. Okay, so I want to show you something here. This new tool I built. When you put that in there, and you'll get access to my reports, you can immediately go get a National Weather Service forecast. I just hit their API, and you can see what Hartford's going to get. But it takes about 10 seconds, and then it'll produce a link down here. Now, what I've got at this is what we call a multi-model forecast. But when you get here, go all the way down to the bottom. And what I want to show you is this. Let's just open this image in a new page, and let's blow it up. You see, this particular graphic shows you for Hartford the last 5 years of precipitation. And what I want you to see is, you notice that your spread is large at the end of the year, between 45 and almost 70 inches. But you see these big jumps like there and there and there. Those are those 2, 3, 4 inch rainfall events that come through, giving you these huge spikes. What I'm telling you is we're observing more of those with time than we did in the past. So since 1980, you've almost quadrupled the frequency of those big, heavy rainfall events.
That's interesting, and it brings with it a lot of management challenges for farmers. Do you see that? You see that trend increasing? I mean, it's hard to predict, obviously, but what do you think?
No. Well, there's no reason, there's no scientific evidence that the trend will not continue. And I'll be honest, I'll drive home today from Nashville and drive through a big part of Kentucky and Illinois, and I will probably be able to count well over 40 or 50 fields in this part of the country where they're doing something about it. We've tripled the frequency of our heavy rainfall events here. And what we do here is put down pattern tile everywhere. All new fields with pattern tile this year.
Great. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up your part of the presentation, Eric. So we'll move on to Rich, if that's okay.
You bet. We'll talk to everybody later. Thanks for the time.
Okay, thank you. So next we'll move on to Rich Morrison. Rich is Vice President of Farm Services at NAU Country Crop Insurance. Leveraging a broad background in the grain business, he provides timely market information and revenue management advice to producers, as well as contributing to a host of publications, reports, podcasts, and his daily market report on WLDS Radio. He is a regular contributor on both the Red River Farm Network and the American Ag Radio Network. With that, I will turn it over to Rich. We can already see your screen, so I will let you take it away. I think you might be muted, Rich.
All right, how about now?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
All right, can you see my screen fine?
Yep, we see you sitting in a truck somewhere.
I am in western Wisconsin today, so running around the country, talking to a lot of growers, but certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. And following Eric, that works out pretty well. He hit a lot of the notes I definitely want to hit on South America especially, but certainly it's been a wild winter for the markets, been really a wild 18 months or so for the markets. And I'm pretty excited about the opportunities we've got for 2022. And what's really interesting is we're still, months away from the growing season, and yet we've got some of the wildest markets we've ever had. So jumping right in, what's going on right now? Inflation, I think, is really the story in the commodity sector. It has been for over a year and a half now, and continues to be. High inflationary periods over time do tend to be favorable for commodities, and we're certainly seeing a lot of that happening. South America, Eric talked about the drought that they've had, and not only the tremendous start to the year that they had, but how it's flipped in the southern part of Brazil, Argentina, and how we continue to see that crop get a little bit smaller. Mr. Putin and what's going on with Ukraine, that has been a market factor for about 3 weeks now, and it seems like, it feels to me like he's almost trading the wheat market at times, that when he says something on a given day, or even when our president says something on a given day, the markets trade higher, then they back off and things trade lower. So that's been the case here this week so far, for sure. We have seen a slow Chinese buying pace, and I think that's maybe a story that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Most of the focus, especially in the oilseed market, has been on South America, but we will be addressing that at some point, I think, in our balance sheet. We'll talk about that a little bit. Energy prices running at 8-year highs right now. Fertilizer prices at record highs. I think those are really the biggest stories at the farm level here over the last few months. And then crop markets running at 11-year highs. And really what I'm looking at there are the crop insurance prices for this year. And we are halfway through the month of February and setting those average prices. But so far through last night, we've got a corn average price at $5.83. If we're able to hold that, it would be the second highest we've ever had, and the highest since 2011. And for contrast, look at the period that we've had the last 9 years. When we were trading, multiple years in below $4 a bushel, and even last year, we're substantially higher. Certainly the opportunity utilizing crop insurance and marketing this year much better than we've seen in the past. In soybeans, if we hold these levels, and I'm pretty certain we're not going to go back down that far, we would have the highest price ever for soybeans for crop insurance. And what both of these mean, they mean two things. They mean our guarantees and revenue that we're able to lock in are going to be the highest we've ever had. And it also means that the price is going to be up a little bit as well this year. But certainly the benefits are going to be tremendous. So behind all the kind of the glitz and the glamour of the markets lately, we do have good underlying fundamental support, and that's driven by world stocks dropping once again this year. Corn, soybean, wheat stocks all expected to be lower here in 2022. And so that's really underpinning these markets. It's really given us at least the initial boost that we've had this year. And investors know that. And, you couple what's going on with inflation to what's going on from the fundamental picture. The hedge funds have been very long in the markets. This is a snapshot of their net position. This goes back over the last 8+ years, but this is their combined position in corn, soybeans, soybean oil, soybean meal, and all 3 wheat contracts. So essentially an overall grain position. These funds are long, the red line on the left, nearly 700,000 contracts of the grains as of last Friday's report. And that is comparable only to last year at this time. Last year, the black line, they were long 800,000 contracts, and they held most of that length, or much of it, on into spring. But once we got the crop in the ground and it got off to a pretty good start around the country, and then once we got into fall with good harvest results and big South American acres, funds had liquidated quite a bit of their long position. Now, in the last 2 to 3 months, they've put a lot of it back on again. I think initially this buying in October was driven by nitrogen prices and a lot of fund buying in the corn market. Some of that switched into soybeans here this winter with the drought in South America. But as of last Friday, they've built a long position close to 700,000 contracts. So the good and the bad here, I think the good is that, of course, what we've benefited from is higher prices. But also, I don't see them being big sellers anytime in the next 60 days, at least until we get some sort of an idea of how acres are going to get in the ground in the United States this year. Now, longer term, it should worry us a little bit because these people are close to a record long position. How much more money do they have they want to spend in the market? That's a big question. But if we get off to a good start, if the crop gets in the ground okay, they've got plenty of selling power here as well. And so to me, the biggest risk I think we've got in the ag markets in the next probably 90 days is right here. It's these funds. And if they decide it's time to get out, it could put some pressure on us. But so far, starting 2022, been a big year for commodities. The energy sector has really been the driver. Diesel, crude oil, natural gas, gasoline, all posting big numbers here to start this year. Soybeans up 17%, cotton, hogs, corn also posting gains so far. Only cattle and wheat a little bit lower here to start the year. But generally, with inflation comes higher commodity prices, and certainly that's what we've been seeing. But when you look at the commodity sector as a whole, oil tends to be the main focus or the driver. And if I look at like the Goldman Sachs commodity index, crude oil is the biggest portion of that. It holds over 20% of that index, which also includes the grains, livestock, precious metals. It includes soft commodities like lumber, cotton, sugar. But crude oil tends to be the biggest driver in it. And the saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. And we've kind of seen that with the oil market going back to the COVID low in the spring of 2020. Now, we've had a few hiccups in here. We've had a few drivers in here. I think initially when this administration took office, the closure of the Keystone Pipeline, whether it made a huge difference volume-wise or not, I think symbolically it was a driver for this market, and you saw a lot of speculative buying jump in the crude market. We saw the Omicron variant back in November cause a bit of a stir and some concern, and the oil market traded down. But once we saw that was not going to have an overall impact on the economy, here we are right back up at highs. Made a new high here this week, nearly $96 a barrel. I'm hearing a lot of people predicting that oil is going to continue to trade up into the 110, 120 range. I think the situation with Ukraine is a potential incendiary for this market, that if that ends up escalating, crude oil is certainly one of the markets that's going to respond the quickest. So that would be one thing that I think is potentially fairly friendly to these markets, to the other markets. And when you look historically at the relationship between oil and soybeans, this chart goes back to 2011. It's fairly remarkable how tight that relationship has been over the years. And if I were to plot this with corn, it would look somewhat similar. So that's why I think you would need to have one eye on the oil market. Certainly be watching the commodities we grow as well, but this oil market is going to dictate a lot of things as we go forward. And of course, we talk about inflation, the consumer price index numbers in December. I think we were 6.8% above last year. Here in January, we were 7.2% above last year. So these numbers continue to get bigger, and that continues to be a driver. But one of the other impacts on the ag sector is going to be interest rates this year. We've already seen a jump in interest rates. Goldman Sachs, this article was out last week, expecting the Fed to raise interest rates 7 times in a row here this year. Initially, we were expecting a 25-point bump in March. Some folks are now forecasting a half-point bump here in March. So we'll see, but I would certainly expect that the cost of money is going to increase here in the year ahead. So start out looking at the soybean market. Beans have been really the driver of all of the ag markets here over the last year or so. When you look at the balance sheet that USDA put out last week, we did have a new report a week ago. The only number they changed was the domestic crush. They bumped it 25 million bushels, lowered ending stocks by 25 million, down to 325 million bushels, which is up from last year. It's quite a bit higher than we were expecting stocks at this time a year ago. And so we're not running out of beans. Historically, this is a relatively small number, but it's not like we're running out. The big number to watch in the months ahead is going to be this export number. And if you would have asked me 3 months ago, 2 months ago, I thought USDA would be lowering this number based on the Chinese purchases that have taken place this year, how many beans have been shipped, and based on the start that we got to the South American crop year. Now, USDA has not changed it. They've kept it at just over 2 billion bushels. And now there are a few folks thinking that number could be a little bit bigger. Today, there was a story that Reuters ran that someone in China is suggesting that they could cut soybean demand by 30 million metric tons this year due to finding other sources of protein to put in their feed rations. So I don't know whether that's China speaking their position, trying to talk the market lower or what, but nonetheless, that number continues to bear watching. And when we get our March report, April report, this will be one of the big ones I continue to focus on. What does USDA do with this number? A lot's going to ride on South America. And a week ago, we did get some updated production estimates out of the Southern Hemisphere. Ag Rural had dropped their crop estimate to 128.5 million metric tons. That is down about 9 million from last year's record. But as Eric had mentioned a couple of months back, we were talking about a 144 to 145 crop in the Southern Hemisphere. Same with CONAB, that's the Brazilian government. They dropped their estimate to 125.47. So some of the other estimates coming down maybe into the low 120s here over the last couple of days. So they are going to be down, but there's a lot of moving parts to this. If they're down 20 million tons, what happens if China cuts demand 30 million tons? There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle. But one thing that I do think is interesting, and Eric mentioned how quick the planting pace was in Mato Grosso and in northern and central Brazil this year. And because of that, they are already harvesting. They're pushing 50% harvested in Mato Grosso. And because of that, they're already loading a lot of boats. This satellite map, I think is incredible that they can pinpoint where vessels of beans have loaded out of Brazil. And you can see the southern group of boats that's going up to around the Horn, going to China. And then you've got this northern set of vessels that are headed into the Mediterranean or into Europe. So a lot of boats that are on the water. And compare this to a year ago, this next map, there were hardly any vessels that were loaded at this point in time. And historically, that's the case. So there's a couple of reasons, and Eric, again, mentioned a few of these. But and so before I get into that, I just want to show you that what's happening to the bean market, because we're seeing so many beans hit the market right now out of South America. Basis levels have started to fall. The Brazilian cash market has fallen. Exporters have started to step away because there's plenty of beans available on the water, but prices are so high right now for spot beans that buyers are not buying them. And we've seen that. China has been in the market the last 2 weeks for soybeans. They've all been for next crop year, the 22-23 crop year. So they have not wanted to pay the premium. And because of that, you've seen this future spread between March and November futures. That inverted market has started to come back together. You can see, go back to fall when the rally started. Most of that was driven by the old crop market, and now it's started to fall backwards. And usually this spread starting to narrow is an indication that the bean market top is probably starting to get in as well. If you compare to some similar years where we were relatively tight on stocks, 2014, that spread started to narrow in March. 2013 started to narrow in March. 2021, a year ago, it started in January. So here we are now in the middle of February. And so, history is kind of on our side that over the, within the next 30 days or so, you would think that this spread probably would continue to narrow as we get more South American beans on the water, and thus the bean market, at least for the moment, would be kind of over with. Now, Eric did show you this map, the root zone soil moisture drought indicator in the Southern Hemisphere, which did show that, most of Brazil, northern central Brazil, still was had a real good crop year. It's turned a little drier lately, but the focus has been in southern Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, Paraná, and as well as across into Paraguay and into eastern Argentina. This area affected by La Nina, certainly where the drought reduced crops were this year. Now, the big impact on U.S., and we go back to that export number we've talked about, has been both on the front and the back end of this year's shipping season. And Eric also mentioned that Hurricane Ida that hit the Gulf of Mexico at the beginning of September shut down the Gulf for about 3 weeks. So any bean loadings that happened off the Northwest Pacific coast. We shipped nothing out of the Gulf at that point in time. Now, October, November, December were all historically relatively good months. But look what's happened here as we've gotten into the beginning of January. We saw some big dives in the loadings. And so we failed to meet some of the recent crop loading years. And as I showed the vessel picture, that a lot of Southern Hemisphere boats are on the water now. And so our window this year was kind of shut on both ends at the beginning and the end. And so to reach that 2 billion bushel number, we're going to have to see something change here. And some people think it might happen at the end of the summer now instead of the beginning. That as Brazil gets real aggressive shipping beans out of the north, their crop in the south is shorter, Argentina's crop is shorter, that they're going to run out of beans potentially by mid-summer, and maybe we'll see at the end of the summer the U.S. start to pick back up again. So there's a lot of moving parts to this bean market right now, but you can certainly see why we've had a lot of fund money that's poured in. And that's what this is showing. We've got the managed fund position in soybeans. Last summer, they were long about 100,000 contracts, this black line. They liquidated most of that as we went into the fall period, as we had a big harvest in the U.S., as we got the acres planted early in the Southern Hemisphere. Funds were big sellers in the bean market. But then we hit the weather snag in December, and the funds jumped back in a big way. Managed funds have built their long position now up to about 154,000 contracts. This Friday, when we get the weekly report, I'm betting it's going to show that they're above the previous high for this date. So they've built up a historically large position. Now, if you look at this black line and see the pattern of the funds and look at the chart on March soybeans, it's been rather close. You know, the funds were big sellers from summer into fall, big buyers here starting in December into where we're at right now. So I think a few things. Number one, this market was due for a correction. If you look at the technical indicators at the bottom of the page, the relative strength index had pushed up into 80 a few days ago. The stochastics lines had shown a market that was ready to turn, and in fact did. There's an old saying, the red line crossed the blue line, and that's why the market went down. Well, there's a lot of truth to that, a lot of people use these indicators as a way to make decisions on getting in and getting out of the markets. And they're really a measure of the volume of trading in an up or down market. And typically when a market gets overbought or oversold, either one, the volume starts to slow way down. You just don't see many more people left that want to buy or want to sell. And so that's what happens. That's what the RSI and the stochastics really measure. Now that we've corrected today, and by the way, I ran this chart early this morning. The markets are higher than what I'm showing on the chart, but we did trade below the 9-day moving average, but we did not trade below the blue line, the 20-day moving average, which we've only penetrated once since back in December when the rally started. So I still think that blue line, that 20-day moving average, is the key for this market. So as long as we stay above that 15-12 level right now, we've got some pretty good support here. As far as anybody with old crop soybeans, if you have any, great, good for you. I would have sold mine out a long time ago. But one strategy I've continued to suggest is to sell any crop and go replace it with an out-of-the-money call option. I'm not opposed to spending 15 to 20 cents on an out-of-the-money option each time I make a sale, because it helps me, number one, to not regret making the sale. And I know I've talked to so many producers this winter that were like, well, if you want to know what the market's going to do, just follow what I do and do the opposite. People are regretting having done what they had done for right reasons. And so, you know, if it helps you to get beyond that, certainly looked at buying some out of the money options. If you had beans to sell today, I'd probably price them and go buy, say, a $17 May call, and just in case this market continues higher here this spring. The corn market, USDA did not make any changes to the balance sheet back in February, last week's report, kept ending stocks at 1.54 billion bushels, which is somewhat snug and is the reason why I think we've got a lot of investment money still sitting in the corn market. We have to make sure that we don't lose a lot of corn acres this coming year. Planted 93.4 million last year. We have to make sure we get within a shouting distance of that number this year. Now, one of the big negatives for the corn market a week ago were cancellations. When you look at the bottom and the middle here, China and unknown, which are usually the same, canceled over 500,000 metric tons of corn sales. And that caught the market by surprise, and quite frankly was awfully negative at that time, and kind of took the bloom off the corn market. But overall, the funds are still holding a big long position in corn. As of last Friday, a record for this week at 372,000 contracts, just barely below the all-time record, which was last spring at 400,000. And that matched what they held back in 2012, was also about 400,000 contracts. So, they don't historically have much buying power left. So, it wasn't a shock maybe to see a little bit of a profit taking break here at the end of last week and the first of this week. But how much more can they add to their position? I guess that's the question I would have. And so that's got me a little bit leery of the market going a lot higher. The flip side of that is I think that these people seem very steadfast in wanting to own corn. And I tend to think that they're going to hold it until they make sure that we're really going to get those acres planted this spring, somewhere around that 93 million acre. So I would think we're fairly safe over the next couple of months, similar to last year's pattern. But if we get the crop in the ground and it gets off to a good start, certainly they've got a lot of ownership that they could decide to liquidate. So to me, that's the biggest risk that we've got here as we head into spring and early summer. But the funds, again, are really responsible for the rally we've had here going back to fall. And I think that kick started with the rally in the nitrogen market. And then it took over with the rally in the bean market here as we got into the beginning of this year. And so as corn continues to try to keep pace with both the input side as well as the competition from soybeans. The 50-day moving average, the gold line, is our best long-term support. That's down at 610, about 30 cents below where the market's at right now. This recent correction did correct the technical indicators. The RSI back down to 57, stochastics lines both show somewhat of a neutral market right now. So I'm not overly concerned about a lot of downside risk at the moment. If I had old crop corn, and I wanted to get it locked in, again, I would probably look to sell and buy a May out of the money option just as a way to re-own the market if it traded higher. So looking ahead to 2022, I thought this was an interesting survey. Farm Progress had this on their website a week ago. That what factor most influences your choice at planting and crops? 64% this year said we don't change, we stick with the rotation. I bet if you took that survey a year ago, it would have probably been 80 to 90%. But this year, with input costs up, things are changing a little bit. 15% said price of the commodity. 21% said cost of inputs to raise the crop. So inputs are getting a lot of people's attention, both the price as well as the availability here as we go into spring. So a lot of focus, especially between beans and corn, on this ratio between soybeans and corn. And if you go back to September, prior to the input costs going up, we had beans at a 2.5 to 1 ratio versus corn price. And a lot of people were talking about big soybean acres getting planted in the U.S. this year. That changed a lot as we got acres planted in the Southern Hemisphere, and as we saw the nitrogen prices rally, we saw the corn market gain versus beans, and that ratio went to 2.2 to 1. And at this point, you had people talking about bigger corn acres this year. But now the spread's gone the other direction. And so I think it's going to be fascinating over the next 60 days to watch this ratio. I'm not sure how many acres can still float back and forth. I think a lot of producers, the majority, have already committed to what they're going to plant. But I still think that there may be more acres this year that maybe changed hands because of farm sales, farms being rented by new producers, some things like that can still swing some acres from one side to the other. So that's what I'm going to be watching really closely over the next 45 to 60 days. But we have had quite a few estimates out on acreage this year. Back a year ago, we planted 93.4 million corn, 87.2 million bean acres. In October, USDA's economists put out an acreage estimate on corn at 92 million and beans at 87.5. Back in December, after that ratio tightened all the way to 2.2, FarmDoc put out a corn estimate at 96 million acres, but a bean number at 85.5 million. So that was a huge shift. Now we've seen some of that go the other direction. IHS Market and ADM both came out about 3 weeks ago with their numbers. IHS was at 91.5 million corn, 93 million from ADM, and beans, they were both in the 87 to 88 million range. But also shortly thereafter, farm futures, based on a survey of producers, they were only at 90.4 million corn and 92.4 million beans. But what I think is kind of fascinating is within 2 months of each other, you had a corn range of 5.5 million acres, and beans, you had a range of almost 7 million acres from the high to the low. To me, that's pretty fascinating that we are going into a growing season with that big of a discrepancy, or that big of an unknown. So, we know we're going to plant 180 plus million acres combined corn and soybeans. Question is, how are they going to get split? So just a second, ignore the lines on this chart, but you can see November beans were very flat as we went into late summer, early fall, late fall. They were trading very, very tight to the vest, $12 to $13. But then we got the South American drought, the March bean contract rallied, November followed along. And we've gone back up, just made a new contract high last week, still trading in the 1430s and 1440s a bushel. I've been telling folks that I think we can make money at these levels. I've been suggesting being a third sold. If that makes you uncomfortable, go buy out of the money options to help cover those sales. I've had producers telling me that I'm 50% sold, I'm 60% sold, because I can look at my balance sheet, I know what my expenses are, and I know I can make the most money I've ever made growing soybeans. And if that's where you sit right now, I would never talk anybody out of selling a bean or corn or anything else, because if you know you've got money in this and got the best opportunity you've had in a long time, I'd consider that an opportunity. So looking at the RSI, still at 74. The stochastics are pointing down a little bit. This market may be a bit toppy, so I'm not opposed to selling it. Similar with corn, although again, the corn rally started earlier, started back in mid-September. And again, I think that was driven by nitrogen price. Then I think beans took over at the beginning of the year, and we've seen this last 40, 50 cents because of the higher bean price. And so we're trading up, $5.90 a bushel. The 50-day moving average, the gold line at 562, really has been good anchor for this market for a number of months now. So I would consider that as good support. But again, if you know you've got money in this market, then I'm thinking at least a third sold for next year. And if that makes you uncomfortable, again, go buy an out of the money option. Talked to a couple of producers in Southeast Missouri, actually about a month ago, that told me they were 70% sold already for next year. They were planning on covering the top end of their crop with crop insurance for this year. They know what their expenses are. They had bought their fertilizer ahead of time. They know that they're going to make more money. They're going to lock in better profit than they've ever done. And they were taking advantage of the situation, which I applaud people for doing that this year. I think the market's given us a tremendous opportunity. We haven't even planted it yet. So, and again, you've got crop insurance available that'll help back up those sales. The RSI and stochastics have moved more into a neutral situation here on the corn over the last couple of days. So looking ahead to crop insurance, we've talked about that a few times, but what are the opportunities from a price perspective? I am a marketing guy. My background is in marketing. Yes, crop insurance does protect bushels, but revenue insurance also protects price. I don't know where my bushels are going to end up this year, but I do know where the prices are right now. And again, I showed this earlier, but through last night's trade, we've got corn averaging 583 a bushel. That would be the highest we've been since 2011, and much higher guarantees for our policies than we've had over the last 8-9 years. Similar for soybeans, we would be looking at a record high crop insurance price right now. So the opportunity from soybean crop insurance is going to be tremendous as well. Two of the products that I'm really most excited about this year are SCO and ECO. SCO is supplemental coverage option, and ECO is enhanced coverage option. Now, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, we wouldn't have talked a lot about these products. But the reason we're really looking at adding this extra layer of coverage this year is from the price perspective. How do I utilize crop insurance to protect price? Both of these products allow me to be able to do that. And so this chart shows you exactly how these products work. They are essentially stacking an extra band of protection on top of your individual level of coverage. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. These are both county level products, SCO and ECO are. So you can stack county level coverage on top of your individual coverage. So if we start out with the blue at the bottom, that is your individual multi-peril protection. For most folks, that's revenue protection or RP insurance. You can buy that up to 85%. Whatever level you buy, that protects your bushels on your farm. The next level is SCO. The supplemental coverage would start at your level of protection and go from there up to 86%. So I'm covering that next band of county level on top of your individual. It does mention here that I can only do SCO or ARC. SCO is a crop insurance program. ARC is through the FSA office, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But they will only let you do one or the other. These are both very similar. They're 86% triggers, and they kind of do the same thing. There's two big differences though. SCO is a crop insurance product. It uses this year's price that's being set in February, and it protects 100% of your planted acres of the crop. ARC is a county level product at 86%, but it uses a 5-year Olympic average price, and it only covers 85% of your base acres for that crop. So you got some major differences there. But the next level above that, if I decided to shrink my deductible, would be to add ECO coverage from 86 to 90 or 86 to 95%. So to me, the question I have with crop insurance this year is, do I do something different than I've done in the past? In the past, maybe I've just used it to try to cover a portion of my input costs. This year, we may be able to use these policies to cover all of our input costs. We may be able to lock in a profit margin. And so to me, that's what we need to decide this year is, what is my goal? What can I do with crop insurance? So go back to the chart I showed you a little bit ago on December corn. That's where these lines come into play. And if we were to start out with a base price on corn at 580, then essentially, if I have an average yield this year, both on my farm and the county, then these policies, these revenue policies, become price put options. And so if I were to have an 80% RP coverage policy with an average, with a yield this year right at my APH, then it would take a 20% drop in price down to 464 to start to trigger a loss. This year, maybe I want to consider bumping that with SCO, bump that up to 86%. Now, if the county has an average crop this year, I've got price protection right at $5 a bushel. If I bump it to 90% with ECO, now I've got my price trigger at 522, and 95% ECO, bump that to $5.50. Again, assuming we have an average yield this year. So maybe with some of these higher levels this year, not only am I covering my expenses, I'm also locking in a profit margin on those bushels. So I do want to show you a couple of examples. And the first one would be utilizing the SCO and the ECO up to 90% on top of my individual level of protection. So I've bumped that up this year. And so I want to show you this with our indemnity worksheet that we've got at NAU Country. And I'm looking at this 10% band on top of my RP policy. So in this example, I'm going to buy an 80% revenue protection policy on the farm. Then I'm going to add SCO to go from 86 or 80 to 86, ECO then 86 to 90%. So I'm adding a 10% band of protection. And for this example, it doesn't matter what my county yield is. I'm going to assume it starts at 169.5, ends at 169.5. So whatever your county is, we're going to assume that we don't have a change in the bushels. Then we get to calculate, what does this 10% band, what is it worth? We get to use the higher of this year's base price or harvest price. And so for this example, I'm going to assume that we start at 580, and I'm going to say the market goes down $1 in the fall. We also get to use our APH. So for producers whose APHs are higher than the expected county yield, you get the benefit of having more dollars. And so we multiply your APH times the base price. In this case, comes up with $1,015 an acre expected crop value. Multiply that by my band of coverage of 10% that I'm buying, that value is worth $101 an acre. Next, we calculate the loss, and because of the dollar loss in price, our revenue went from 983 in the county down to 814. So we ended up producing 82.8% of the expected county revenue. which falls below the trigger at 90% on this policy. So we ended up having a 7.2% loss in revenue. Divide that by the band of 10%, get 72%. So we're going to collect 72% of this green box, this 101.50, which gives us an indemnity check of $73 an acre. So the only reason we got paid here was because of the drop in the price. Yield was flat, but because price went down $1, we got a check for $73. So in this example, it worked exactly like a put option. Price went down $1, we collected. The one thing I would point out, if I'm just buying 80% RP coverage only, or 75, we ended up producing 82.8% of the expected revenue. So on my farm, if that was the same number, even at 80%, we would not have collected anything. We would have had to have added this extra coverage this year in order to see some sort of a payment. Now, what I show you here on this worksheet is just one example. We got a harvest price and a final yield. This indemnity matrix is going to show you over 200 potential examples. So we've got county yields across the top. We've got prices on the left-hand side. And just kind of a quick walk around the matrix. If we were to have a better than expected county yield, we get somewhere to the right of the expected number. 508 here, in this example with 173.7, 508 or $5.08 corn is starting to trigger a payment. So even at $5 and above, we would potentially be getting some money back from this policy, which I find kind of hard to believe that we would have a policy that would pay at $5 corn. If you start moving across and down here, you start maximizing that entire 101.50. And at that point, essentially is where your individual coverage would start to kick in. If you fell below that certain level, in this case, 80%. If we end up in the top left part of this page, then price went up because we had maybe a bad crop around the whole country. If that's the case this year, the crops were down in the county, but the price rallies, our dollars of coverage go up. And that's because back on that worksheet I showed you, you get to use the higher of the spring or the harvest price. So that's where the harvest price option kicks in. In a drought year, the market goes up. In the fall, you get to calculate that, use that number, thus your dollars of coverage went up as well. I did have somebody last week ask me, what happens if we end up in these white boxes? My comment was that you've probably had one of the best corn revenue years you've ever had, because you've got decent yields, prices are still up, and you didn't end up having a 10% loss in revenue in the county. And so in that case, you probably had a really great year this year, given how high prices are at as we start the year. So that's what we want to have happen. We would just as soon buy the policy and not have to use it. But in the event we have a minor loss, then it would start to kick in. Another example I want to show here takes this a notch further. Maybe I'm going to take my money that I would have spent on SCO, and in this case, I buy an 80% RP policy, and I'm going to skip that 80 to 86 window, but get my trigger as high as I possibly can. We are allowed to do that. You could just decide to buy the ECO band of coverage at the top. And the reason I would want to do that is 95% is going to trigger a loss a lot quicker. And especially if we're looking at a price drop year potentially, or even a shallow loss on bushels, that's going to trigger a loss a lot quicker. So if I go look at the same numbers, but just use the band up here from 95 to 86, that 9% band is going to be worth about $91. But when I do the same loss calculation, remember a minute ago, that was at 82.5%. So in this case, it stops at the formula we've got in here stops it at the bottom of the coverage. But we essentially lost that entire 9% band of coverage because of that price drop. And thus, we're going to collect that entire $91 an acre. Now, I did the math off to the side. A price drop to $5 would maximize this $91. So an 80-cent price drop, you would get that entire $91 an acre. So, or if you end up in a yield situation, a yield loss situation, the county loses 5% on bushels, we would start to trigger a payment as well. So granted, it is going to cost a little more to go up to this level. One thing a producer could look to do, you do have the opportunity to lower your dollars of protection. So instead of 91, you could cut it in half. You would still trigger a loss at the same price. You would pay half the premium. You'd collect half the money. So there are some things that a producer can do here. But if you really think that there's a chance of just a shallow loss this year, then maybe this is the year to look at it. And Every year I might not. You know, a year ago I probably wouldn't have looked at this as much. Next year we may not again. But because of how high we're starting out on the prices, maybe this year it makes sense. And if I look at the matrix here, there's not a lot of white boxes here. You don't have to go down very far on price or to the left on bushels before we start to trigger a payment. So this would be something to at least take a look at. If you're not familiar with it, visit with your crop growers agent. We can tell you a lot more about ECO and SCO for this year. On soybeans, it's going to look the same. You know, beans, if you were to start out with just an 80% only, you're at 11.20 a bushel. If you get up to 86, you bump that up to 12 bucks. 95, you get well over $13. So if your goal is to try to utilize maybe the ECO and or the SCO as a way to help manage price risk, we've got that opportunity. The last topic I want to hit on is government programs and crop insurance. And the reason is that these things do overlap this year. And I mentioned before, it's because SCO and ARC essentially are substitutes for each other. So to me, the most important decision I have to make this year relative to the farm program is whether or not I'm going to buy SCO. I put this letter out about a month and a half ago, just kind of explaining that again. You know, our decision at FSA really boils down to ARC and PLC. And if you remember back at the 2018 Farm Bill, PLC is price loss, ARC is area revenue protection. And the first election you made in 2018 was for 3 years. Each year following that, it's an individual election. You get a chance to reelect a program. But if you're interested in PLC, PLC is price protection at these blue numbers. Not very stellar at 370 corn, 840 beans, 550 wheat. A year ago, these were the prices in the second column. Anybody with wheat in the PLC program that ended last August would have gotten a check for 45 cents. But the marketing year we're in right now, in the middle column, we're way above the PLC prices. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say next year is going to be the same. We're going to still be way above these blue numbers. So should I look at the ARC program? Well, ARC isn't great either. It uses the red numbers in the fourth column, 370, 912, and 550. We take those times your county's 5-year Olympic average yield times 86% to come up with the ARC trigger. That's not going to be real rosy either. So should I look at SCO? SCO supplemental coverage, and that's an alternative. But the big benefit to SCO is the price we're using, and that it covers 100% of your planted acres, where ARC covers 85% of your base acres. So I looked at these two examples in the county that I was just showing you a minute ago. The first option up here, you can probably figure out, is the ARC program. But ARC is going to start out with 370 corn times, in this county, 178.04 times 86% would give us a county revenue trigger at $567 an acre, and it would cost you nothing. I could go to the FSA office today, sign up, doesn't cost anything. Or I can talk to my agent and buy SCO. SCO is going to use the base price being set right now, which today it's over 580 a bushel times 169.5 in this particular county times 86% would give me a revenue trigger at $831 an acre. And I'm buying this 6% band of SCO from 80 to 86%. That's the part we're talking about. But I'm picking up $260 some in additional higher trigger, but it does cost me $8.74 an acre. So to me, this is the biggest decision I make relative to the farm program this year. Do I buy SCO or not? If I'm going to buy SCO, then I cannot sign up for ARC. If I accidentally do, my SCO coverage will be voided, and I have to pay a 20% premium penalty. So I do not want to make that mistake. So the first thing I would do relative to your farm program this year is talk to your crop insurance agent and decide whether SCO makes sense. And if you decide to buy it, then when I go to the FSA office, I have to sign up for PLC. If I decide not to buy SCO, then I'm probably going to go ahead and sign up for the ARC program, just in case there's a county, maybe bushel disaster that might possibly trigger a payment even with the higher prices. But that's, again, the decision you should make first is whether to buy SCO before going to the FSA office. So some points to remember, again, if you go SCO, then you have to go PLC. If not, then I'm probably going to sign up for the ARC program. Producers can buy ECO. We talked about that band from 86 to 90 or 95, no matter which program you elect. you could skip SCO, you could just buy ARC or sign up for the ARC program and then go buy ECO to protect that band at the top. Your crop insurance programs, RP, SCO, ECO, these cover 100% of your planted acres. The PLC and the ARC programs cover 85% of your base acres. Also, the crop insurance programs do include the harvest price option. As long as you're buying a revenue-based policy, these other programs are going to have the harvest price option. PLC is only a price drop program. ARC is only using that 5-year Olympic average price that's not very good. So a lot of benefits to the crop insurance program this year. And again, a year ago, I wasn't as excited about SCO and ECO. 2 years ago, very limited excitement. But because of how high prices are this year, because of the opportunity we've got, that's why we're talking a lot about it. So coming up, we've got now till the end of the month to set our crop insurance prices. February 21st will be the markets closed. Next Monday, the markets are closed for President's Day. March 9th will be USDA's next supply demand report. We'll be definitely looking at the export numbers in those reports. The day after every month's USDA report, I host a webinar called the NAU Country Aftermath. We cover a lot of the same stuff we did here today. The recent crop report, impact on the markets, crop insurance, government programs. If you don't want to watch it live, it is at 10 o'clock the day after the report. But if you don't want to watch it live, you can always go to YouTube and type in NAU Country and see any of our webinars. March 15th is our big deadline date for crop insurance, as well as at the FSA office. And then March 31 is when we get a prospective plantings report from USDA with its first official set of numbers for this year's acres that are based on surveys taken in the middle of March. So a lot of things happening here over the next month or two. If you're not familiar, what I do for NAU Country, put out a lot of market information. I do an opening bell phone call every morning right after the market opens. It usually comes to you probably 9:38 or so in the morning with an update, 2 minutes long, how the market's open and why. The market report is an afternoon email letter that we try to send out every day. Update on the markets, crop insurance pricing, you name it. The aftermath is the webinar I talked about just a second ago. I do a podcast called Kicking Up Dust. It's on Podbean if you want to subscribe, but do that every couple of weeks just to kind of give an update on what's happening in the markets. And then I usually tweet out every morning during the break at 8:30 to 9 o'clock. I'll put something out about the overnight markets. So if any of this is of interest, please let your agent know. We can get you signed up. It doesn't cost anything. Our mission this time of year, of course, it's crop insurance season, and we do want to try to help you make decisions on how to protect your farm. But the rest of the year, we want to try to get information on how to help you use that policy to be a better marketer. So with that, I've appreciated the opportunity to visit. If you've got any questions, any thoughts, feel free to shoot them over and I'll try to answer.
Sure. So thank you very much, Rich. That was very informative. A lot of good information there. If people want to ask questions of Rich, you can type them into the question panel on the GoToWebinar control panel. You can expand that by clicking the red arrow in the right-hand corner of your screen and just type it in and we'll ask him of Rich. Rich, what are some of the main things that you would be thinking about if you were a producer in the Northeast right now? Excuse me, what would be on your mind in terms of key decisions to make?
This year I think it's about profitability. I really do. I think in most years past 8-9 years it's been an uphill battle to some extent, especially this time of the year when it might not have made sense to forward sell crops, certainly at below break even. So a year ago at this time, 2 years ago at this time, we were talking about getting coverage that's going to protect your bushels. Then maybe when the market rallies at some time, you got to be ready to make sales to take advantage of it. This year we've got that opportunity right now. So I think we have to look at our strategies a little bit different this year than maybe what we've done in the past, just because of the opportunity that's in front of us. And I can't guess what's going to happen this summer, with weather. Eric talked about that too. We can put out projections and whatever, but I think it boils down to knowing my cost of production. And if I've got the tools to be able to lock something in, go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity. And we may not get it again for a while. you know, I'm a little nervous. If you look at the historical tendencies on price, you know, the last time we had high prices in 2011, 12, you know, they started to kind of tip over like they always do. You know, commodity markets are like that, where you know, you have when you have high prices, people figure out how to grow more of it. And so usually they go away after a while. And so I definitely want to take advantage of this window while we can.
Fair enough. What do you see as, you know, in terms of crops? I mean, there's obviously corn and soybeans, but there's some other minor crops in there too. Where do you see the greatest profit potential this year?
Well, that's a good question. You know, boy, I don't know. You know, I would tend to think that depending on when you booked your input costs, corn is going to be a potentially a good one. I know that the guys that bought input or locked in their inputs cheap, you know, before last fall's rally, are real excited about the opportunities growing corn this year.
Yep.
Soybeans are going to be what they're going to be. You know, most people's inputs are a little, you know, a lot less there. So I think the corn side of things are where people are probably looking at the most feast or famine, so to speak, this year.
Okay. I think we'll wrap it up. Any final thoughts that you have, Rich?
No, just going back to the beginning, I'm excited about the opportunity for 2022. It makes my job a whole lot easier in a year like this, trying to talk about ideas and markets for the year. It's a lot more fun than it was 2 years ago, believe me. So I think from a farming standpoint, I think there's a lot of relief as well. I think from the lending standpoint, there's a lot of relief as well this year. So the mood seems to be a lot better from people I'm visiting with, and for 2022, and we just don't want to let it get away from us.
Great. So with that, I think we'll sign off. I do want to call people's attention to farmcrediteast.com/webinars. That's where all our webinars live, past, present, and the future. So we do have an ongoing webinar series. We have a couple more planned at least for the rest of the season, and the recordings are posted there as well, including the recording of this webinar will be posted there too, probably by the end of the day today. So with that, I think we'll sign off, and I will thank you very much for your time, Rich, and really appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you all. Take care.